I knew the forest was wrong, the moment it spoke my name, not whispered, spoken, as if something ancient, buried beneath roots older than kingdoms, had finally decided to acknowledge me, and from that moment on, every shadow watched me with a purpose I was never meant to understand. The moment the apparition dissolved into the shifting air, leaving behind only the echo of its presence, I remained standing in the half-collapsed chamber, with the weight of its warning pressing deeper than any wound. The place felt colder, not because the creature had taken warmth with it, but because something else had arrived, a silence dense enough to be a presence of its own. It gathered at the stone edges of the room, lingering in the cracks like an intelligence that had been waiting for the entity to leave, so it might move closer. My thoughts carried the taste of iron, my breath felt too loud, and beneath the floor, I felt the subtle tremor of something awakening, as though the land itself had shifted to acknowledge that the boundary between the living and the forgotten had thinned beyond recall. The walls pulsed faintly, not with light, but with memory. My memory, though I could not recognize what scene they were trying to offer me. It was as if the structure wanted to show me something buried, something I had once known, something I had once feared. The stone was trying to speak through sensation rather than sound, transmitting impressions like a pulse through the veins of the building. I could almost feel fingers around my spine, guiding me toward the broken corridor. It felt less like being summoned and more like being claimed. Outside, the wind shifted with a violence I had not heard before. The world beyond the ruin had changed during the apparition's visit. The night felt swollen, thick with fog that clung to the broken arches and spread across the ground like a slow tide rising from the underworld. It had a scent not of decay, but of soil overturned after years of rest, the smell of something ancient dug up and allowed to breathe again. It was the same scent that clung to my clothes after encountering the rift on earlier nights, but stronger now, sharper, as though the breach had widened while I wasn't looking. I stepped into the corridor, and the stones under my boots felt softer than stone should feel. It was not the softness of rot, but of something partially real, partially forming, as though the ruin itself had begun to shift between two states of existence. The ceiling above bowed inward, the arches bending just subtly enough to appear animate in the corner of my eye. It was not an illusion. The building was reacting. Something about my presence, or the entity's message, had stirred the architecture into awareness. I felt watched from every angle, from every ripple of shadow. I walked anyway. The air thickened the farther I moved from the chamber. It no longer felt like breathing atmosphere. It felt like drawing in the exhalations of something buried beneath the stone, as though an ancient creature slept under the ruin and breathed upward through unseen cracks. The humidity clung to my skin like a second layer of flesh. Beneath it all, I heard the faintest resonance, a low hum, rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat. Not mine, not human. The hum followed me, not from behind or ahead, but from the stone itself, resonating through every surface, as if I were walking inside a creature's ribcage. The dim, crooked corridor eventually opened into a courtyard, long since overtaken by vines that had petrified in place, their grip on the stones frozen in an unnatural stillness. The vines were grey-white, as if bleached by centuries of moonlight, but I sensed no life in them. They felt sculpted, placed intentionally, arranged in patterns that skirted the edge of meaning. When I brushed my fingers against one, the contact sent a cold spark across my skin, like touching something that was not meant to be touched by the living. The sky above the courtyard was shifting, a gradient of bruised purple and metallic green, colors that did not belong to any natural dusk or dawn. It felt like the world had forgotten what time it was supposed to be. The air shimmered in a way that resembled heat distortion, except the night had grown colder. The stars above appeared blurred, as if seen through water. And then I realized it was not the sky that shimmered, it was the boundary between this place and the world outside of it. The ruin was no longer entirely anchored to the land it occupied. I remembered the entity's final gesture, the way its form unraveled like smoke devoured by gravity. It had looked at me as though recognizing me from another time, as though it knew something I had yet to learn. The weight of that moment pressed harder, now the significance settling in my mind with a heaviness that made my thoughts drift toward the forgotten edges of my memory. There were things I had lived through that I did not recall, things I had buried so deeply that even I had convinced myself they never happened. But the ruin remembered, the entity remembered, and now the land remembered too. Across the courtyard stood an archway that had once led into another wing of the old structure, but now appeared warped, leaning in a way that defied the rules of masonry. The stones bent as if softened by heat, but there had been no fire here. As I approached, the hum beneath the ground deepened, as though my steps energized whatever pulse lived beneath. The air vibrated faintly at the base of my skull. It felt like being drawn toward the archway not by instinct, but by a tether I had not consented to. Beyond the archway was darkness, not the absence of light, but the presence of something that devoured illumination as soon as it touched the threshold. My torch went dim, its flame shrinking as though starved. The corridor beyond seemed to absorb not only light, but warmth, sound, and even the concept of distance, for the darkness did not appear to recede. It was not a tunnel I was looking into, it was a mouth. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, everything shifted. The hum beneath the ground ceased. The air lost its weight. The oppressive presence lingering in the ruin vanished, replaced by something colder, something infinitely more ancient. I was no longer walking through stone hallways that remembered me. I was walking across a boundary into a place that had never known me and did not care to. The torch's flame steadied, not because the air warmed, but because the darkness that had consumed it simply receded, as if studying me from afar, as if letting me in. The chamber beyond the archway was enormous, far larger than anything that could fit within the ruin's physical layout. It stretched into a cavernous expanse of stone, veined with faintly luminescent patterns, resembling constellations drawn beneath the earth. The patterns shifted as I looked at them, rearranging into shapes that felt familiar in the way dreams feel familiar, recognizable yet impossible to name. The stone itself glowed faintly with a pale blue light, revealing a circular platform at the center of the chamber, carved with symbols I had seen once, long ago, in a moment I had convinced myself was a nightmare. I stepped forward, and the platform responded with a soft vibration, the symbols pulsing beneath my feet. A cold wind rose from below, carrying whispers that did not belong to any tongue I knew. The sound burrowed into the back of my mind, stirring an instinctive dread I had not felt since childhood. It was a fear not of what I saw, but of what I remembered seeing once before, something I had forced myself to forget. And then the platform lit up. The platform brightened with a sudden breath-stealing intensity, not like flame or magic, but like the cold radiance of something that had existed long before either concept had taken shape in the minds of men. The symbols beneath my feet spiraled outward, lines of pale blue light branching like veins through the stone, until the entire floor resembled an immense living map. The air grew sharper as the glow intensified, carrying the metallic taste of a storm not yet born. I felt the hair rise on my arms, as though charged by unseen electricity. The chamber inhaled, and for a moment I sensed that I was standing inside the lung of something that could exhale worlds into existence, or crush them into dust between breaths. The wind circling the room tightened around me, forming a slow spiral that lifted my cloak with unnatural precision. It wasn't random movement. It was deliberate, the controlled motion of an intelligence probing the edges of my presence. It traced along my skin like icy fingertips, studying the shape of my body, lingering where old wounds had scarred me. Every place where a past battle had left its mark
seemed to throb faintly in response, as if resonating with memories I had thought long buried. The wind was learning me, remembering me, deciding what part of me it wished to take. As the light grew stronger, shadows retreated to the outer edges of the chamber, clinging desperately to the crevices between the stone. But they did not vanish. Rather, they condensed, thickening into opaque pools that writhed with subtle motion. They were not shadows cast by the light. They were entities in their own right, ink-like forms that danced independently, resisting the illumination as though it were poison. Their movement felt familiar, echoing distant visions from nights when I had awoken breathless, with the sense of something standing over me, watching with formless, lidless patience. The platform under me shuddered, not violently, but with the soft tremor of something enormous shifting far below. Stone tiles cracked in lines that matched the glowing patterns, the glowing glimpses of an abyss beneath the chamber, an endless beneath the chamber, an endless beneath the chamber, an endless pit swirling with currents, whose taints swirling with currents, but none is container, streams it to the chamber.
The mist moved, like breath, rising in slow exhalations, carrying with it faint whispers, some sharp, some stretched, all spoken in a cadence that felt older than any language carved into mortal memory. The light converged around my feet, spiraling upward in threads that wove themselves into tendrils of energy, wrapping around my legs, my waist, my chest. And each time they crossed over my skin, I felt a tug, not physical, not spiritual, but something deeper, as if they were sifting through memories I had forgotten I possessed, pulling images from the depths of my subconscious. Flashes appeared and disappeared too quickly to process. A forest burning under a violet sky, a figure standing in a river of ash, a tower collapsing into a void that expanded rather than consumed, a woman's silhouette vanishing into mist that glowed with the same pale blue as the symbols beneath me. The chamber responded to each memory the tendrils extracted. The walls shifted subtly, their texture rippling like water disturbed by a single drop. The constellations etched across the stone rearranged themselves into new shapes, with every image the tendrils pulled from me. This place was not only reading my memories, it was reorganizing itself to match them, as though it had waited for this moment not to reveal something to me, but to reveal itself through me. The tendrils reached my throat, and for a moment I felt an instinctive desire to resist, to crush them, to sever their connection before they delved somewhere too deep. But the impulse died as quickly as it rose, not because I was calm, but because something suddenly pressed against the edges of my consciousness, a presence vast, ancient, and impossibly cold. It was not watching me through eyes, it was not perceiving me through senses, it was simply aware of me, in the way a mountain is aware of a stone resting upon it. My existence registered, but with no particular significance. I was a temporary tremor on the surface of its eternity. The tendrils rose higher, brushing against my jaw, my cheeks, the corners of my eyes. When they touched my temples, everything inside the chamber changed. The light vanished. The wind stopped. The hum beneath the ground died. Silence swallowed the room with such absolute force that for a moment I felt disoriented, as though every sound I had ever known had been stripped from existence. My heartbeat seemed too loud, then too faint, then non-existent. My breath made no sound at all. Even the shifting movement of my muscles felt muted from the inside. Then the shadows began to move, slow at first, subtle shifts along the edges of the chamber, as though gathering their strength. They rose from the corners like smoke rising from embers, coiling upward into tall, slender shapes. They moved with fluid precision, adjusting their forms in response to one another, aligning themselves into a circle around the platform. There were 8 of them, identical in height, identical in shape, though shape was a loose word for beings whose outlines blurred and fluctuated like ink in water. They had no faces, no limbs, no features, and yet their posture conveyed attention, not curiosity, not recognition, but evaluation, as though the tendrils had awakened them and they had emerged to judge whatever had been summoned to the center of their chamber. The silence deepened even more, becoming not just an absence of noise, but a physical pressure, something that pushed inward against my skull. It felt as if the chamber demanded I remain motionless, and my body obeyed despite my mind's intentions. The shadows leaned slightly forward as a single unified motion, condensing just enough that the faint light reflecting off the stone revealed glimmers of movement within them, impressions of limbs that did not fully exist, shapes that defied anatomy. The platform beneath me pulsed once, and the shadows responded. They expanded violently, erupting outward like tendrils of darkness, snapping into branches. The chamber plunged into absolute blackness, not because light had faded, but because darkness itself became the dominant presence, swallowing everything in an instant. The stone, the air, the sense of space, all vanished. I felt weightless, suspended in a boundless void, where up and down had no meaning. Yet the tendrils that had wrapped around me earlier remained, their pale glow the only anchor in a sea of nothingness. The shadows swirled around me, forming an immense vortex of darkness that rotated with slow, deliberate momentum. It felt like standing inside the eye of a cosmic storm, one born not of weather, but of ancient will. The tendrils of light tightened around my body, though not enough to restrain me, only enough to ensure I did not drift away from whatever process had begun. And then, from within the vortex, something began to take shape. Not a figure, not a creature, a memory, but not mine. It hovered in the darkness like a fragile flame, a moment suspended outside of time, the vision of a battlefield drenched in blue fire under a crackling sky. I saw silhouettes moving through the flames, distorted by heat and shadow. Their bodies were not fully human. Elongated arms, curved spines, faces split by luminous fractures that revealed glimmers of the pale blue energy now holding me. They marched toward an unseen enemy, with purpose, not rage. They moved like beings fulfilling a duty forged before their births. The battlefield flickered, replaced by a towering structure carved of obsidian and bone, rising from a barren landscape under a starless sky. The architecture pulsed faintly with the same luminescence that ran through the chamber's veins, suggesting a connection so ancient it predated nations, kingdoms, and civilizations. The shadows around me stirred again, their forms elongating into shapes that resembled twisted echoes of the beings in the memory. Echoes shattered by time, reduced to silhouettes, stripped of substance, lingering only as remnants of something once whole. The memory shifted again. This time I saw a figure standing atop the obsidian structure. Its form was tall, regal, cloaked in darkness that shimmered with threads of lightning. Its face was obscured, but its presence radiated authority, dominance, inevitability. In its hand it held something, an object I could not fully see, though its shape pulsed with the same pale blue radiance as the chamber. The moment I tried to focus on it, the memory resisted, fracturing into blurred fragments, as though the chamber itself forbade me from perceiving it too clearly. The shadows tightened their circle around me. A new sensation rippled through the void. Recognition. Not my recognition. Theirs. The tendrils of light rose higher, encircling my head with delicate precision. They did not touch my skin this time. They hovered just above it, vibrating with accumulating energy, preparing for something I could not name. My breath thickened in my chest. My vision wavered at the edges. I felt the vortex of darkness tilt, the entire void tipping slightly as though the chamber were adjusting itself for the next step in a ritual I had unwillingly triggered. Then everything stopped. The vortex halted mid-rotation. The shadows froze. The memory vanished. The platform grew silent. For the first time I sensed emotion from the shadows, uncertainty. And then the abyss opened beneath me. The abyss did not open beneath me. The abyss did not open like a crack in stone.
or a sudden collapse of the platform. It opened like an eye, slowly and with dreadful intention, revealing layers of depth that stretched far beyond any physical realm I had ever traversed. It felt as though the chamber had peeled itself away, shedding its stone and structure to expose the why. Shedding its stone and structure to expose the raw, pulsating darkness beneath reality. The fall was not a movement downward. It was a surrender to something ancient, watching from below. Something that had waited patiently for the moment. I would stand directly waited patiently for the moment. I would stand directly over its gaze. I felt no impact, no acceleration, no rush of air. The sensation was weightless, a drifting descent through a darkness. The sensation was darkness as though the total seemed that felt alive. A presence so vast even thought seemed diminished within it. The tendrils of light remained around them, their soft radiance now fragile in comparison to flighted in them. They flickered, fastened by the fluid of abyss, as though they were lost remnants, as though the lost remnants. So the dying, 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 to visit, so that the six that adopted the dark fluid, flooded the dark fluid, the light, changed the dark fluid,
This sensation was weightless, drifting like memories unanchored from any mind. They twisted slowly, some elongated into impossible forms, others curled inward like creatures hibernating through eternity. They carried no eyes, no faces, yet each one seemed to observe me as I passed. They did not move closer. They simply drifted, witnessing, cataloguing, acknowledging my descent with a patience that bordered on indifference. In the far distance, a faint glow shimmered, shifting like a lantern seen across a black ocean. It pulsed softly, drawing me toward it, not by force, but by inevitability. The tendrils of pale blue light tightened around me again, not in fear, but in resonance, as though recognizing the glow below, as though recalling something long forgotten. My body continued to descend, though I could not tell if I was sinking slowly or falling for an eternity, compressed into a heartbeat. The glow expanded, revealing itself not as a single source, but as countless fragments, shards of light suspended in the abyss, like pieces of a shattered star. They formed a slow, orbiting pattern, swirling around a central axis that twisted like a coiling serpent of light. Each shard pulsed at a different rhythm, creating a pattern of illumination that resembled breathing. Their glow brushed against the void, revealing ripples in the darkness, as though the abyss itself were disturbed by their presence. As I drifted closer, the shards began to align themselves, shifting from chaotic orbit into a circular formation. They spun slowly, creating a halo of pale luminescence that framed the central darkness in a way that suggested a boundary, a door, a seal, a threshold. The tendrils around my body pulsed in response, their light synchronizing with the rhythm of the shards. The shadows above me, far beyond the ruptured surface of the chamber, shifted faintly, their stillness disturbed by the alignment occurring deep below. A low vibration passed through the void. It was not sound, it was pressure, an ancient response, a signal or a warning impossible to decipher. The shards pulsed again, and within the dark center of the ring, something stirred. At first, it appeared as a ripple of deeper blackness, a distortion within the already infinite void. Then it expanded, blooming outward like ink dropped into water, forming tendrils that reached toward the shards, but did not touch them. The movement was slow, disciplined, almost reverent. It felt like watching a creature awaken cautiously, aware of the fragility of the world around it, unwilling to break the delicate balance it existed within. The darkness shaped itself into something more defined, not physical, not entirely spiritual, but a presence condensed into form. It grew taller, its edges sharpening into a silhouette that resembled a towering figure draped in an absence of light. It did not glow, yet its outline was perfectly visible against the abyss, as though the void itself refused to overlap with its form. The tendrils around me shuddered, reacting instinctively. They tightened once as if bracing, then relaxed, accepting whatever this being represented. A faint coldness spread across my skin, a chill so profound it felt like the breath of deep winter exhaled across my bones. The figure moved, or rather the void bent around it, shifting to allow its presence to expand. It did not approach, it did not retreat. It simply existed, and the weight of that existence radiated outward like gravity, drawing everything, including my attention, toward it. Images flickered at the edges of my vision, not memories. Echoes of something older, a land of frozen stone beneath a sky of fractured stars. A colossal gate, carved into a mountain of black ice, a river of spirits flowing upward instead of down, a throne of shadow suspended above an ocean of silence. The figure pulsed faintly, like a heart beating once every century, and then something changed. A ripple passed through the abyss, radiating outward from the figure in concentric patterns. The shards trembled, the void recoiled, and the tendrils of pale blue light binding me began to unwind, loosening their grip until they hovered inches from my skin. They pulsed weakly as though the presence within the dark ring had disrupted the energy that sustained them. The figure expanded slightly, its silhouette sharpening at the edges until it resembled a humanoid shape, elongated limbs, a torso that seemed carved from mist, a head crowned by shifting darkness that coiled and twisted like storm clouds. Its face remained an empty void, yet I felt something observing me from within that emptiness. Not eyes, not awareness. Something more primitive and more powerful, something that perceived not who I was, but what I was in relation to the abyss. The vibration in the void intensified, rising in a slow crescendo that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the darkness. And then the figure collapsed inward, not like a dying flame, not like a shadow consumed by light, like a singularity folding into itself. The shards burst outward with sudden violence, streaks of pale blue light tearing across the abyss like starfire, illuminating the shadows that drifted within the void. The tendrils around me snapped tight, pulling me with force toward the collapsing form. The abyss convulsed, its rippling waves shifting into chaotic turbulence. The darkness felt angry now, agitated by an event that violated its ancient order. The shards spiraled faster, merging into streams of light that wove themselves into patterns I recognized, patterns carved into the chamber, patterns etched into the ruins I had explored, patterns that had appeared in my dreams long before I ever encountered the rift. The collapsing figure exploded into a surge of darkness that surged outward like a tidal wave. But instead of swallowing me, it bypassed me entirely, the tendrils around my body forming a shield that deflected the blast. The void dimmed, then brightened, then shifted into a distorted blur. Something massive had awakened, something the shadows in the chamber feared, something the abyss knew, something the entity from the ruin had warned me of without words. The tendrils tightened, and I was pulled upward violently. The abyss peeled away in streaks of black and blue, the void folding in on itself as I ascended at impossible speed. The drifting silhouettes blurred past me. The shards vanished in a flash of light. The vortex of shadows near the surface brightened, reacting to my return. The chamber's stone climbed toward me, its symbols glowing with frantic intensity. I breached the surface of the platform in a shock of icy air. The shadows around the room recoiled violently, retreating into the cracks and corners as though burned. The stone shuddered, the room lurched, and the entire ruin trembled as if struck by an earthquake born not of nature, but of a cosmic imbalance. Something followed me out of the abyss. Not a being, not a memory, a tear, a fracture in the air. A jagged line of darkness that hovered above the platform like a wound in reality. It pulsed once, and the ruin screamed. The silence that followed was not the kind of quiet born from peace, but the dense, suffocating suspension that occurs when the world itself holds its breath. The forest around him had grown unnaturally still. No leaves rustled, no branches creaked, no insect dared to sing. It was as if the very pulse of the land had withdrawn from the clearing, retreating from whatever presence had begun to coil at the edges of perception. He remained crouched beside the dying embers of the creature he had slain, but the victory felt hollow, displaced, incomplete. The air carried the unmistakable sensation of being watched, not by a beast stalking prey, but by something ancient, analytical, and vastly patient. He slowly rose to his feet, each movement deliberate, instinct rooted deeper than reason. The moon above him felt wrong. Its pale glow no longer offered clarity, but instead cast a dull sheen, as if filtered through an unseen veil. Shadows pooled unnaturally long across the ground, stretching toward him with sluggish intent. He tightened his grip on the hilt at his hip, not out of fear, but because every instinct honed through years of wandering demanded he be ready. Then he sensed it, a tremor beneath the soil, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The earth shivered, as though stirred by something moving far below the roots, burrowing upward. His mind raced through possibilities, none of which brought comfort. The tremor became a pulse. The pulse became a rhythm, and that rhythm became unmistakably deliberate. Not an earthquake, not an animal, a heartbeat. One impossibly large, and it was rising. He took several steps backward until his shoulder brushed the trunk of a massive pine. The bark was cold, colder than it should be, even in the thin chill of early morning. A prickling sensation crawled along his spine as he realized the temperature around him had dropped rapidly, frost forming at the tips of leaves, despite the season. When the ground cracked, it did so with a sharpness like bone splitting. Then again, and again, a fissure ruptured across the clearing, splitting the soil open like the spine of a torn book. A deep, hollow exhale gushed from the gap, warm, almost human, and yet carrying the thick metallic scent of something ancient, buried too long. Black vapor began to seep upward, coiling like smoke, yet flowing with purpose, forming shapes that dissolved before the mind could define them. Whispers threaded through the air in a language older than the kingdoms, and older than the ruins he had walked. He recognized none of the words. He understood all of them. A warning, a hunger, a promise. The fissure widened violently, sending shards of frozen earth flying outward. He shielded his face with an arm, teeth clenched, boots digging into the ground for stability. The vapor condensed, slowly taking the vague silhouette of a torso, elongated, malformed, with limbs that seemed stitched from shadow itself, where its head should have been. An orb of swirling darkness pulsed like a star collapsing inward. No creature he had ever studied, fought, or heard tales of had borne such a shape. This was no monster. It was an entity, something that should never have surfaced into mortal lands. Its presence did not threaten the body first, it threatened the mind. Memories began to rise without permission, pushed to the surface like dead fish in poisoned water. Losses he had buried, faces he had forgotten, the heat of a home long abandoned, the cries of battles he had survived by virtue of stubbornness rather than skill. It ravaged through him like a storm, searching for places to break. He braced himself, grounding his consciousness as he had been taught by those who understood the dangers of unseen realms. Breath became anchor. Pain became tether. He forced the memories back down, one by one, until only the present remained. The entity seemed amused. It reached an elongated limb toward him, not with speed, but with dreadful certainty. The shadows at its edges peeled away like torn cloth, evaporating the nearer they drifted toward his chest. The closer it came, the thicker the air grew, turning breath into struggle. He could not strike it. Not yet. It was not fully manifested. Physical blades meant nothing against half-formed nightmares. but its influence could still be resisted. He pressed his palm against the talisman beneath his armor, a small relic he had carried since childhood, forged of iron and etched runes, not magical, just a memory carved into metal, a human anchor, something the entity did not possess. The creature paused, as though its attention sharpened. The orb of darkness that served as its head tilted slightly. The whispers shifted tone, becoming probing, testing, matching its curiosity against his defiance. Then, without warning, the entity lunged, not with its limbs, but with its presence. A wave of crushing pressure struck him like a tidal force, slamming him backward against the pine trunk with a violent crack. His vision blurred, ears rang, breath vanished. He tried to push off the bark, but the invisible weight held him pinned with relentless intent. His ribs creaked, his heartbeat staggered. Darkness crept into the edges of sight like ink bleeding across parchment. Then he saw something movement past the entity, faint but unmistakable, a flicker of pale blue light weaving between the trees. It swirled like a wisp, growing brighter until it pierced the haze clouding his vision. Not an illusion, not a trick of fading consciousness, a presence, one he knew, one he had not sensed in months, one that should not have been here. The blue light coalesced into a figure, tall, cloaked, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had walked too closely with death to fear it anymore. The figure raised a hand, and the light intensified, forming a protective arc that sliced through the tendrils of the entity's influence. The unseen pressure shattered. He gasped as air flooded back into his lungs, dropping to one knee, clutching the earth like a lifeline. The entity recoiled, not in pain, for such a concept likely meant nothing to it, but in acknowledgement, the kind given to an unexpected challenger. The blue-lit figure spoke no words. Instead, the energy swirling around them tightened, forming sigils that hovered in the air like burning script. The ground trembled again, this time not from the entity rising, but from the force being summoned against it. He pushed himself to his feet, staggering but resolute. The entity's shadowed torso began to distort, as though its connection to the fissure beneath it faltered. The figure turned their head slightly, just enough for him to understand. Stand, fight, now. He drew his blade, not out of desperation, but partnership. The entity surged forward with a shriek that rippled through the clearing, distorting the air itself. He met it head-on, blade cutting through the vaporous limbs with arcs of silver light, as the cloaked ally anchored the creature with chains of glowing runes. The battle began, and the forest, silent until now, finally remembered how to scream. The clearing convulsed under the ferocity of the confrontation. The creature's cry tore through the night, like a blade, distorting the air, bending the frost-coated branches until they cracked under invisible pressure. He lunged forward, his blade slicing through a mass that was neither flesh nor smoke, each strike cutting pieces of shadow that dissolved into tendrils before touching the ground. The entity was not truly corporeal, but every blow slowed its progression, disrupted its focus, and forced its form to unravel in brief bursts of instability. The cloaked ally tightened their stance, the sigils encircling them glowing brighter. Runes spun outward like molten shards, anchoring themselves into the soil, forming a containment circle that pulsed with ancient authority. The creature's limbs jerked and twisted unnaturally, dragged back by invisible chains that coiled around it and tightened with every violent contortion. Yet the entity did not weaken. It adapted. Its torso split open, revealing a swirling void where a heart might have been, and from that void surged a wave of shimmering distortion. The world around them bent in impossible angles. Trees elongated, their shadows stretching like melted wax. Gravity itself flickered, loosening its grip for an instant as the ground rippled like water. The blast struck him before he could shield himself. His body hurtled backward, tumbling across the frost-hardened soil, breath knocked from his lungs as he crashed against the remnants of a half-petrified stump. Pain tore through his ribs, sharp and immediate,
but the instinct to survive eclipsed the pain. He forced himself upright, every movement edged with grit and defiance. The cloaked figure was still standing, though the runic circle flickered dangerously.
Several of the glowing chains faded, broken by the entity's surge. The creature twisted its limbs, reforming itself into a new shape, taller, sharper, its silhouette resembling a grotesque mockery of a human frame. It hovered above the ground, anchored to the fissure by tendrils of black mist that writhed like serpents. He wiped blood from his lip and steadied his breath. He had fought horrors before, ghastly beasts, cursed abominations, twisted remnants of failed magic, but nothing like this, nothing that pressed into the mind as forcefully as it pressed into the flesh. The creature, sensing his momentary weakness, extended one jagged limb toward him. The limb lengthened unnaturally, slicing through the air with a whispering hiss, aimed at his chest. He rolled aside just in time. The limb stabbed into the ground where he had stood, carving a spiraling trench that glowed with residual energy. He pushed himself to his feet, boots digging into frozen soil, and in one fluid motion he lifted his blade again. The cloaked figure raised both hands, voice silent but power surging. The sigils around them ignited in blinding luminescence, their edges sharpening into threads of pure light. The runes began to overlap, weaving themselves into a seal far more complex than anything he had seen. They were preparing to bind the entity permanently, but they needed time, and time was exactly what the creature refused to give. The entity unleashed a screech that tore small fissures in the ground. Its limbs multiplied in an instant, one becoming two, two becoming four, each one lashing outward with lethal intent. It launched itself toward the cloaked figure, seeking to break the ritual before it reached completion. He didn't think, he moved. His body surged forward, driven by instinct and purpose. He intercepted the creature mid-lunge, slamming into its shifting mass with a force that rattled his bones. For a moment he felt weightless, suspended inside the cold density of the entity's form. Shadows pressed against his skin like ice water, clawing at his consciousness, whispering fragments of memories he had tried for years to bury. But he held on. His blade flashed, carving through the center of the entity, disrupting its cohesion. A burst of smoky essence exploded outward, sending both him and the creature spiraling in opposite directions. He hit the ground hard, the impact forcing an involuntary grunt from his throat. The entity convulsed, form flickering rapidly as it attempted to reconstruct itself. The cloaked figure seized the opening. The ritual seal erupted with a soundless detonation of white-blue energy, expanding outward like a dome. The light collided with the fissure, fusing the cracks with shimmering frost, then struck the entity with the force of a falling star. The creature's limbs shattered into ribbons of shadow. The void in its chest pulsed violently, shrinking, compressing, collapsing in on itself. Its torso twisted and cracked, emitting an inhuman resonance that vibrated through bone and soil. The seal tightened. The entity thrashed. The forest trembled, and finally, with a thunderous implosion of dark vapor, the creature was pulled back into the fissure. The light from the seal surged once more, sealing the gap shut with a slab of frost-coated stone. The echoes of distortion faded. The oppressive weight lifted from the air. The unnatural silence dissolved. It was over. He staggered upright, limbs heavy, breath ragged, body bruised but intact. The cloaked figure lowered their hands slowly, the runes dissolving like embers fading into night. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The wind finally rustled through the branches again, tentative, as if the world were testing the boundaries of its restored normalcy. He approached the figure, though cautiously. The blue glow that had surrounded them dissipated, revealing only the faint outline beneath the hood. They turned toward him slightly, as though assessing the state of his injuries. Before he could speak, the figure lifted a hand, not aggressively, but with purpose, and pointed to the sealed fissure behind them. He understood immediately. This was not the end, only the first sign. The ground beneath the forest had been compromised, disturbed by forces that did not belong to mortal lands. Entities like the one they had faced did not rise alone. They were scouts, heralds, fragments of a deeper corruption, bleeding into the waking world. The cloaked figure lowered their hand and began walking toward the deeper shadows of the forest, leaving behind only a faint trace of the fading pale blue aura. He took a step forward, intending to follow, but paused when he noticed something on the ground where the fissure had been sealed. A mark, engraved into the frozen stone, not by the cloaked ally, but by the entity during its final moments. A symbol he recognized. A symbol he feared. A symbol that had only ever appeared in one place, in the old texts, in the forbidden margins describing an ancient catastrophe buried by time. The symbol of the Hollow Court. A power long thought dead. A name whispered only in nightmares. His heart sank, not with fear but with certainty. Whatever had awakened beneath the forest was not a creature. It was the beginning of a calling, and he had been chosen to answer it. His journey, once shaped by survival and wandering necessity, had now been forcibly tethered to an ancient conflict. The seal would hold only temporarily. The Hollow Court did not relinquish its claim easily, and whatever force had pierced the barrier between worlds would try again. He tightened his grip on his blade. He turned toward the path where the cloaked ally had vanished, and without hesitation, he followed into a forest that felt far darker than before, carrying the weight of a destiny he had never asked for, toward a war he had unknowingly been walking toward his entire life. The deeper he walked into the forest, the more the world around him seemed to shift, not visibly, not with sudden distortions or unnatural phenomena, but in subtle, creeping ways that tugged at instinct rather than sight. The trees grew taller, their trunks broader, their branches twisting like ribs interlocking above him to form a vaulted canopy that blotted out the moonlight. Moss coated the roots in heavy drapings, the soil grew darker, richer, almost wet, and the air hung thick, carrying a weight he felt in his bones. The trace of blue light left behind by the cloaked ally pulsed faintly, as though guiding him deeper into a realm untouched by mortal footsteps for decades, perhaps centuries. With each pace, he sensed the boundary of the familiar slipping away, replaced by something older, heavier, and more watchful. He paused when he reached a fork in the path, two narrow trails splitting like the parted jaws of some great unseen beast. The leftover glow drifted to the right, as thin as mist and just as ephemeral. He followed it without hesitation. For a while, there was only the sound of his breath and the distant echo of nocturnal creatures returning to their routines, now that the immediate threat had passed. But the peace was an illusion, thin as smoke. The forest was recovering, yes, but it was recovering from the presence of something that never should have existed, and it would not forget. As the trail descended into a hollow, he felt it again, the faint tremor beneath the earth. Not strong enough to crack the soil this time, not strong enough to disrupt his footing, but unmistakable, a pulse, a whisper of the fissure's lingering connection, a reminder that the seal was temporary. By the time he reached the heart of the hollow, the blue trace had grown brighter, pooling like vapor around the base of a stone formation that looked eerily like a half-buried monolith. It was older than the kingdom's founding, older than the ruins scattered across the northern cliffs, older than written history itself. The surface was cracked, the lines filled with soft lichen, but beneath the moss he could faintly make out symbols carved by hands, long turned to dust. The cloaked figure stood in front of it. They did not turn as he approached, though he knew they sensed him. The air around them shimmered with an energy that was neither heat nor cold, but something beyond both, like the last breath before waking from a dream. Without speaking, they pressed their palm gently against the monolith. The stone answered. A soft hum vibrated through the hollow, subtle but resonant, like the first pluck of a string on a forgotten instrument. The symbols beneath the moss faintly illuminated, revealing intricate patterns that spiraled outward in concentric rings. The light spread slowly, as though awakening from centuries of slumber. He stepped closer, feeling the hum in his chest, in his bones, in the memory of the battle they had survived. The cloaked figure lowered their hand, letting the light settle. He waited, giving them room to speak, or to act, first. But silence stretched long, and it was clear that words would not be offered easily. So he asked the only question that mattered. What was that creature? The cloaked figure's hood shifted slightly, as if considering how much to reveal. Their voice, when it finally emerged, was neither loud nor soft, but carried an ageless quality, like the last verse of a forgotten prophecy. A herald. The word struck him deeper than expected. Heralds were never solitary. If one had risen, more would follow. And the hollow court, he said slowly. Why now? Why here? The figure remained still for a long moment. When they finally moved, it was only to gesture toward the monolith. As their hand brushed its surface, the light within the stone shifted again, this time shaping itself into rough outlines, like constellations forming across its cracked surface. But these were not stars. They were rivers, veins, paths, lines of power running beneath the land. For the first time he understood, the monolith was not a marker, it was a map, and something beneath the world had begun to move. The figure's voice came again, weighty and deliberate. The seal that once bound them weakens. He felt a tightening in his chest. How long? The figure turned their head slightly, though he still could not see their face. Only the faint shimmer of pale blue eyes under the hood. Not long enough. The forest seemed to exhale, as though mourning a truth it already knew. He let the weight of the revelation settle. The herald they had faced was only the beginning, an opening note to a symphony of ruin, and the hollow court, long believed to be myth or exaggerated folklore, was awakening. What do they want? He asked quietly. The figure lifted a hand once more, and the monolith responded with shifting patterns. The glowing veins twisted inward, spiraling toward a single point near the northern mountains, a place he recognized with a grim sense of inevitability. Balance undone, the figure said. The borders between realms collapse. Their hunger is not revenge. It is reclamation. Reclamation of what? Of land, of souls, of the very fabric that separated their world from whatever darkness the hollow court ruled. He didn't ask. He wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered now. What must I do? The figure finally turned fully toward him. Their presence carried a gravity that pulled at his resolve, not as a burden, but as a calling. The kind one doesn't choose, but inherits. Follow the fractures, close what you can, and when you reach the heart of the first breach, do not face it alone. He opened his mouth to speak, but the figure raised a hand gently, not in warning, but in farewell. The blue aura dimmed, the forest wind stirred, and the figure began to dissolve, not abruptly, not violently, but softly, like morning mist dispersing under the first touch of light. Their form unraveled into strands of pale energy, drifting upward into the branches above, before scattering across the hollow, like motes of dying starlight. He stood still long after they faded, alone with the monolith, alone with the knowledge he never wanted, alone with the truth that the path ahead would tear pieces from him he had not yet realized he could lose. But the forest was no longer silent. It whispered, it warned, it beckoned. He placed his hand on the monolith, feeling its fading warmth, absorbing the last remaining pulses of the cloaked figure's power. And when the final glow dimmed, he stepped back. The fractures were spreading, the heralds were rising, and he, whether he accepted it or not, had become the last barrier between the waking world and a hunger older than waking world and a hunger older than empires. He took a breath, then another. Then he turned toward the northern trail, the path where the fractures but faintly through the soil, and began walking. The darkness waited, the whole course,
stirred, when the night, for the fervida, the mortgage, the nerve, for more that, not now the words. Each text carrying deep into the innocent, in the initial,
His breath was steady, practiced, but each inhalation scraped against the memory of the herald's scream, the fissure's pulse, the cloaked figure's dissolving silhouette. He carried these memories like fresh wounds, raw, stinging, and too recent to ignore. Hours passed, though the moon never seemed to shift. The forest canopy was too thick to allow celestial movement to guide him. He walked guided only by instinct and the faint tremor in the soil, the pulse of fractures deepening, multiplying, spreading like cracks across brittle glass. Eventually the forest thinned, not into open land, but into a plateau of ancient stones. They jutted from the ground in uneven clusters, sharp and jagged like broken teeth from a colossal beast. Moss clung to their surfaces in velvety blankets, but beneath the growth he could see the faintest hint of symbols, older than the monolith, carved so deeply that time itself had failed to smooth them. He approached the tallest of the stones. The moment he stepped closer, a shiver crossed his spine. Not cold, recognition. The symbols were the same as those etched into the final mark left by the herald, the sigil of the hollow court, carved here long before the kingdom was ever conceived. He reached out and brushed dirt from the stone, revealing an entire sequence of interlocking symbols that curled like running script down its surface. The pattern spiraled toward the stone's base, where the soil was unnaturally dark and soft. Kneeling beside it, he noticed a faint indentation. The earth here was still settling, as if something massive had recently pushed upward through the soil, then retreated. He stood slowly, sensing the truth. This place had trembled recently. Not from an earthquake, not from the herald they fought, but from something larger, something older, something that had brushed the underside of the world and then descended again into the depths. For a brief moment he considered returning to the monolith to study its map again, but instinct told him the fracture beneath this plateau was too important to ignore. So he searched, moving quietly, methodically scanning the ground, the stones, the spaces between them. It wasn't long before he found it, a sliver of air that didn't belong, a seam between two stones where the breath of the earth exhaled outward in a faint but unmistakable current, warm, damp, ochre-scented. The kind of air that rose from hidden caverns or deep tunnels carved by forces not bound by the usual laws of nature. He pressed his hand against the seam. The stone shifted, not heavily, barely enough to notice, but enough to tell him this was no ordinary formation. It responded to presence, to proximity, perhaps even to purpose. He pushed harder. The stone did not move, but something beneath it did. A groan rumbled through the plateau, subtle but resonant. The ground trembled faintly beneath his boots. Leaves shivered in the branches overhead, and the seam widened, releasing a new breath of air, this one laced with the unmistakable scent of decay. A cavern, a hidden one, and judging from the tremor beneath his feet, a living one. He tightened his grip on his blade and stepped closer. The moment he crossed the seam, the world tilted. Not physically, but perceptually. The forest sounds dimmed, as though muffled by unseen hands. The air thickened, his pulse echoed louder in his ears. The space around him sharpened in ways that made his vision feel too clear, too precise, as if something watched him from within his own mind. He descended slowly into the narrow opening, feet sliding across uneven stone steps, carved not by tools, but by time itself. The air grew warmer the deeper he moved, swirling around him in gentle currents that carried whispers, not in audible words, but in impressions. Memories not his own, fear, hunger, joy twisted into pain, echoes of something ancient, dreaming beneath the earth. The cavern opened into a chamber, massive, circular, suspended in twilight glow, emitted by clusters of bioluminescent fungi, clinging to the walls like clusters of dying stars. The ground was uneven, layered with ancient fractures. Some were sealed by crystalline formations. Others still glowed faintly, alive, pulsing with energy from the other side. And in the center of the chamber, he stopped. Breath caught. Something impossible stood there. A structure, a throne, carved from obsidian, so black it seemed to swallow the faint blue glow of the cavern entirely. It was massive, towering, formed from a single block of stone, shaped with a precision that no mortal craftsman could ever achieve. The throne was empty, but its presence filled the chamber with a weight that pressed heavily against his chest, as though the air itself bowed in subservience. Around it, arranged in a perfect ring, were 6 smaller constructs, pillars, altars, or perhaps markers. Each one bore a different sigil carved deeply into its surface. Each sigil pulsed faintly. He recognized 3 of them from the monolith, but the other 3, he stepped closer to examine them. The symbols spiraled outward in patterns that evoked emotion rather than language: dread, longing, cold calculation, insatiable curiosity. They felt alive, each one exuding a different sensation that crept along his skin. He approached the first unfamiliar sigil, the one that radiated cold dread. The closer he drew, the colder the air around him became, frost forming along his gauntlets and on the folds of his cloak. His breath turned to mist. The sigil pulsed, once, twice. Then a whisper entered the chamber, not through the air, through his mind. A hollow, resonant voice that echoed from the depths of memory and nightmare. 1 throne, 6 heirs. He froze, muscles tightening, blade lifting instinctively, though there was no visible threat. The voice spoke again, layers of meaning woven between each syllable. 1 awakens, all return. He took a step back. The sigils on all 6 pillars flickered in unison, as if responding, as if aware, and the throne, empty moments ago, now seemed darker, heavier, more present. He felt watched by something without shape, something vast, something patient, something waiting. Then the cavern trembled. A low vibration rolled through the chamber, shaking dust from the ceiling, sending ripples through the glowing fractures at his feet. The pillars responded, their sigils flaring to life one by one, first one then another, until all 6 pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat, far too slow to be human. He steadied himself, gripping his blade with both hands, just as the fractures on the chamber floor began to glow in patterns, lines of shimmering light weaving between the pillars, forming runes that pulsed outward in a spiraling pattern toward the throne. The air thickened, the pressure increased, and deep beneath the world, something stirred, something that recognized him, something that marked him, something that knew he had survived the herald's attack. A whisper reverberated through the chamber, a chosen wanderer in a world growing hollow. The fractures pulsed again, once, twice, a third time, and then the chamber went silent, silent in a way that stole breath, silent in a way that preceded catastrophe. He froze. The throne darkened further, absorbing the light from every fracture, drinking it until the cavern dimmed into near darkness. Then something moved behind the throne, slow, deliberate, massive. Not a creature, not a herald, something worse, something that had been waiting, something that had noticed him. The air thickened with its presence. The stones beneath his boots vibrated. The fractures glowed like veins stretching toward a heart awakening from deep slumber. He took a single step back, and then two enormous eyes opened behind the throne, not glowing, not blinking, just opening, cold, sharp, inhuman, and utterly aware of him. The cavern did not tremble. It bowed. The ground seemed to pulse beneath his boots, as if the soil itself had been taught to imitate a dying heartbeat. Each throb carried a muted vibration up his legs, crawling through tendons and marrow until it reached the base of his skull like a whisper that refused to form words. The fog ahead, once a drifting, half-alive curtain, now moved with deliberate slowness, as if aware of the hunter's presence and unwilling to retreat. Instead, it coiled inward, forming tight spirals that resembled the hollowed structure of a ribcage, inviting him deeper into a place that had never known daylight's comfort. He felt the sting of the cold again, not from the air but from the memory trapped within it. The aftertaste of the rift's presence lingered around him, metallic and raw, like the echo of a wound gouged into the world by something incapable of regret. Shadows swam at the edges of his sight, too slow to be threats, too shapeless to be dismissed. They drifted in uncertain circles, their movements reminiscent of creatures deprived of purpose. It was a kind of grief, he realized, the grief of something ancient that had forgotten its own origin. He walked deeper. Roots protruded through the ground like twisted fingers groping for escape. Some pulsed faintly, as if carrying blood rather than sap, while others trembled at his passing. Something had awakened them, or perhaps something had hollowed them out and left its pulse behind. The hunter could not decide which possibility was worse. The air began to thicken, forcing each breath to become deliberate, almost ritualistic. He resisted the urge to tense his jaw, knowing tension would draw the rift closer, would make it curious, and curiosity from something that had no boundaries was a danger far greater than any physical wound. A sound rose behind him, not a footstep, not a creature, a distortion. It was the kind of sound that happened when silence cracked. He did not turn, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The rift lingered on awareness, not motion, and if he acknowledged the crack, it would answer back. Instead, he maintained his pace. The trees ahead leaned inward, bending as though compelled by an unseen tide. Bark peeled itself open in thin strips, revealing pale webs of fungal tissue beneath, tissue that twitched, responding to vibrations he could not hear. He watched as spores drifted upward, like ash from an invisible fire, vanishing as soon as they touched the thicker portion of fog, consumed or absorbed. It was all the same. He reached the clearing, and immediately understood why the rift had not allowed the surrounding forest to die. It needed a frame for what lay at its heart. A massive stone monolith rose from the ground, not carved but grown, as though the stone had learned to mimic the posture of a sentinel. Its surface shimmered with faint veins of black and violet, pulsing in lazy intervals that matched the rhythm beneath the earth. The air around it trembled, bending the world like a warped reflection on disturbed water. But it was not the monolith that forced his breath to thicken. It was what hovered beside it. A figure, tall, elongated, impossible. Its body was composed of layered shadows that moved independently, as if stitched together by a force that barely managed to hold them in place. Its head tilted slowly, not shaped like a skull, but like a crescent, a curve that held no facial features, only a deep hollow that devoured the surrounding light. Its limbs stretched downward, grazing the earth without touching it, leaving small ripples of distortion each time they passed. The hunter felt the pressure of its presence settle against his chest, cold and heavy, like a hand pressing gently against his sternum, not aggressive, not territorial, observational. The rift had given this one shape, and the shape was studying him. A faint hum rose in the air, not from the entity, but from the monolith itself. The sound vibrated through the hunter's bones, passing through him like a message he lacked the anatomy to fully receive. But fragments flickered in his mind anyway, visions of barren fields, of skies cracked open like glass, of silhouettes crawling across a horizon that trembled like a dying heartbeat. The entity shifted. Shadows peeled away from its torso, like veils caught in a wind he could not feel. The hollow of its crescent head widened, not physically but perceptually, as if its awareness intensified and the world responded by adjusting his perception to accommodate it. The hunter felt a subtle pull inside his mind, not invasive but inevitable, like gravity asserting itself after a moment of hesitation. Images formed at the edge of his consciousness, not memories, not warnings, more like outcomes. Branches of possibility, sprawling in all directions, some blurred, some sharp, all anchored to the monolith behind the entity. The rift was not a place, it was a hinge, a threshold between what the world was and what it might become if left unchallenged. The entity drifted closer, a fragment of fog peeled away from it, drifting toward him like a drifting petal of darkness. When it touched the air near his cheek, he felt a cold that was not temperature, but truth, something spoken without voice, something that did not ask for permission to be known. It showed him a place, an ancient one, submerged beneath mountains, where an entire civilization had once attempted to bind the rift using rituals carved into stone and blood. He saw them failing. He saw their last moments, not of terror, but of surrender, their silhouettes dissolving into the fog that now coiled at the edge of the clearing. The message was not a threat. It was an inheritance. The entity retreated slightly, its shape flickering at the edges, suggesting it had delivered all it intended to convey. The monolith pulsed again, once, twice, a slow, steady rhythm. The hunter understood the meaning, though he did not know how he understood it. Something was awakening beneath the forest, something older than the rift's current manifestation, something that did not emerge often because the world rarely crossed the threshold that called it forth. He felt the shift in the soil before he heard it. A deep rumble coursed through the ground, shaking loose the dirt around the roots. Trees trembled, shedding brittle shards of bark. A circular pattern formed at the base of the monolith as cracks split outward, glowing with faint violet light. The pattern resembled a sigil, but one not carved by human hands. It formed itself, reacting to something that stirred far below. Then the earth split, not violently, smoothly, as if cut by a blade with infinite precision. A narrow fissure opened beneath the monolith, expanding into a glowing wound. From within, a low resonance crawled upward, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate the air more than the ground. The fog recoiled slightly, as though recognizing a force greater than itself. The entity turned, its hollow face angled toward the fissure, its entire form tightening like fabric drawn by an unseen thread. Its shadows folded inward, wrapping around it in denser layers, as if preparing for the emergence of something it did not wish to greet unguarded. The hunter braced himself, because whatever rose from that fissure would not be a creature, would not be a spirit, would not be a spirit, would not be a natural part of the world at all. It would be an answer. And answers in places like this were rarely merciful. A surge of violet light burst from the crack, climbing upward like a column of smoke. The air twisted violently, forcing the hunter to shield his face with his arm. A roar followed, low, echoing, ancient, not produced by lungs, but by a chasm. The trees bent almost to breaking, roots tore themselves free of the soil. Even the monolith quivered, as though bowing to whatever rose beneath it. Then something emerged, a shape, massive and shifting, as though carved from the very fog but infused with stone and bone. Its surface writhed, layers of mineral and mist sliding over one another, like plates of armor that had never learned to settle. Four limbs struck the ground, sending tremors outward. Its head rose slowly, revealing a vertical maw that split open without tearing, lined with interlocking ridges that resembled jagged runes more than teeth. The entity of shadows stepped back, not in fear, but in recognition. The hunter felt the world hold its breath, because this creature, this presence, did not belong to the rift. The rift belonged to it. The creature that had risen from the fissure seemed to reshape the very concept of form as it moved, its body folding and unfolding as if obeying geometric laws the human mind was not built to grasp. Each shift in its structure generated a sound, low, grinding like the friction of continental plates sliding beneath oceans. The hunter felt the vibration ripple through his bones, rattling against the quiet certainty that he was witnessing something the world itself struggled to accommodate. The first step the creature took landed with the weight of an earthquake muted by distance. Soil rippled outward in concentric waves, as if the ground had briefly liquefied beneath the pressure of its limbs. Trees bowed violently in its direction. Birds hidden deep within the forest burst from the canopy in frenzied spirals, fleeing not from danger, but from inevitability. The very air seemed to falter in how it carried sound, as if unsure how to transmit the presence of a being that existed in defiance of physical boundaries. The entity of shifting shadows, the one formed by the rift itself, remained still, its elongated form tightening, its hollowed head angled directly toward the emerging giant. It made no movement of aggression, no retreat. It simply regarded the creature with an intensity that suggested an ancient familiarity. And in the tension between them, the hunter sensed a silent dialogue, one older than language, older than memory. The creature exhaled, not breath, not air, something deeper. A pulse of raw pressure exploded outward, bending the fog backward in a spiraling motion. The hunter felt it push against his chest like a shield pressed by unseen hands. His breath caught, not in fear, but in the certainty that the creature had not yet chosen to act. It was simply stating its arrival, announcing itself in a world that had forgotten the scale of its existence. The monolith behind it pulsed once more, slow, strained, as if its energy were siphoned by the creature's presence. Cracks formed along its base, spreading upward like a web of fractures. Light flickered inside those cracks, dull and fading, like the final sparks of a dying ember. The monolith had served as a guardian, a seal, perhaps even a tether, but it was no match for what had emerged from below. The hunter watched the creature's head tilt as if sniffing the world. The vertical maw pulsed slightly, a subtle contraction of its runic ridges that produced a faint, resonant hum. When the hum reached the fog, the swirling tendrils recoiled as though burned. Even the rift-born entity's form tightened further, its shadows drawing closer together like muscle preparing to absorb impact. Then the creature shifted its attention to the hunter. Its entire mass rotated slowly, almost delicately. The plates of fogstone around its torso slid apart, then sealed again, creating a deep resonance that rolled across the clearing. Its massive fractured limbs spread outward, anchoring into the ground with crushing certainty. Its maw widened, revealing the spiraling void of its interior, not a throat, but a singularity of purpose. Light bent slightly toward it, pulled by a subtle gravitational distortion that whispered of impossible depths. The hunter felt the ground beneath him respond. A tremor rippled outward from the creature, spreading through the soil as though searching for him. The earth's heartbeat, the one he had felt earlier, quickened, aligning with the rhythmic vibration of the massive being. The world was synchronizing itself, unwillingly, to the presence of something that commanded not just space, but consequence. For a moment, he felt the creature see him, not as prey, not as threat, but as relevance. A thin line of fog peeled away from its surface, drifting toward him with a slow, deliberate motion. Unlike the rift's fog, alive, searching, whispering, this fog moved with gravity, with intention shaped not by emotion, but by inevitability. When it reached his boots, it curled around them like a spectral vine before seeping upward along his legs, coiling around him, with almost ceremonial precision. It did not burn, it did not numb, it simply connected. The world fell silent. A vision erupted behind his eyes violently, like a story forced upon his consciousness by something that remembered truth in its original form. He saw a world not ravaged by the rift, but shaped around it, a world where ancient beings like the one before him roamed freely, sculpting landscapes through sheer presence. He saw civilizations trembling beneath their footsteps, not in fear, but in reverence. And he saw those beings descending into slumber, one by one, as the world's energy waned, burying themselves deep beneath mountains and forests, to await a time when the balance would falter enough to call them forth. That time was now, and he was the trigger, not by heritage, not by prophecy, but by choice. The vision ended abruptly, snapping him back into the clearing as the fog dissipated from his body. The creature lowered its head. The hunter realized something unsettling. It was bowing, a gesture not of worship or submission, but of recognition, acknowledging him as the first mortal in ages to witness its reawakening, without being unmade by it. The gesture lasted only a moment, but its meaning carved itself into the air, into the soil, into the very structure of the rift. Then the creature rose to its full height, towering above the treetops, its limbs fracturing the air with shimmering distortions. It turned its attention toward the sky, as though listening to something far beyond mortal hearing. A deep rumble gathered in its chest, building into a resonance that shook loose leaves and unsettled the roots beneath his boots. The rift-born entity shifted as well, its shadows drawing upward like tattered wings, caught in an unseen storm. It drifted backward, distancing itself from the creature with a motion that was almost deferential. The hunter understood what was coming an instant before it happened. The creature roared, not with sound, but with presence. A wave of distortion blasted outward in a perfect ring, flattening the grass, bending trees to near breaking, and tearing through the fog like a blade through silk. The monolith shattered behind it, collapsing into fragments of dull stone that scattered across the clearing like fallen stars. The crack beneath it widened, glowing violently, before collapsing inward, sealing itself with a final, thunderous pulse of violet light. And then the creature began to dissolve, not dying, transcending. Its massive form split into thousands of drifting fragments, each glowing faintly with runic light. The pieces spiraled upward into the air, merging with the fog that had once resisted them. The forest trembled as they passed, absorbing the resonance that the creature released into the world. The rift's fog thinned, not dissipating, but receding, pulled toward the fading fragments, as though guided by a new command. The hunter watched as the being dissolved fully, leaving behind only a faint tremor in the soil, and a thin spiral of fog drifting upward toward the sky. Silence returned, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of aftermath. The rift-born entity remained. It did not dissolve. It did not retreat. It drifted toward the hunter, its crescent head tilting slowly. The monolith was gone. The ancient guardian had awakened and departed. The balance had shifted, and now the rift had been left without its keeper. The entity stopped an arm's length from him. Its hollowed face widened slightly, an aperture opening in its darkness, revealing a faint, pulsating ember deep within, like a star struggling to ignite. It leaned closer, not threatening but inevitable. The air trembled as it examined him, not physically but fundamentally, as if mapping his presence onto the new structure of the world. A single realization settled into his mind, with cold, irrefutable clarity. The creature below had awakened because of the rift. It had risen to evaluate the threat. It had bowed to him, and now that it had departed, the rift had chosen him to fill the vacancy. The entity drifted backward, its hollow face closing slightly. The fog thickened around its form, spiraling in a slow ceremonial motion. The forest trembling ceased. The pulse beneath the earth faded. The world settled into a fragile calm. Then the entity pointed, not with a hand,
with its entire being. Its shadows intended a thin, trembling line toward the deeper forest beyond the clearing, toward a distant horizon, where the fog glowed fleetly like a sleeping storm. Something awaited him there. Not a creature, not a vision, not a creature, not a vision, a beginning. The entity dissolved, slowly, deliberately, leaving behind a single drifting, then below it, leaving behind a single jerking, ember of faint violet light. The hunter stepped toward it. The light responded.
And others in the climbed, but drived his rind. This was not the end of the rift story. This was the end of the world that had existed before, and the beginning of the world he would be forced to shape alone. If you felt the pull of something ancient while listening, don't run, let it in. And before the next veil tears open, subscribe, follow the saga, and step deeper into the darkness with us. The hunt isn't ending, it's only beginning.